Shadows beneath the cross. The quiet intimacies of the medieval world. It is said that the medieval night was quieter than ours. Fewer lights, fewer voices, and far fewer distractions. But beneath that silence, beneath the bells that marked time in cloisters and the low whispers of prayers in wooden halls, there was another world, one not spoken of in sermons or written in noble charters. It was the quiet pulse of human desire, both feared and sought after, shaped by 1,000 rules no one dared to question aloud. To live in the Middle Ages was to live between heaven and hell. Every gesture of affection, every glance, was shadowed by the thought of sin. The Church did not only govern what men believed, it dictated what they could feel, and when. A kiss could be a prayer or a temptation. A marriage could be both a sacred bond and a political arrangement. And in between those lines, humanity persisted, quietly, secretly, endlessly. The idea of love, as we understand it now, barely existed. Marriage was an alliance, a strategy, a matter of property and inheritance. Among peasants, it meant survival, the joining of two sets of hands to till the same patch of earth. Among nobles, it meant land and heirs. Yet even there, in the stone corridors of castles, behind heavy tapestries and cold beds, tenderness sometimes bloomed like a weed breaking through rock. The Church, for its part, believed that the body was a vessel of temptation. The words of St. Augustine echoed through centuries. That desire was the proof of humanity's fall from grace. Monks copied those words by candlelight, their pens scratching quietly over parchment, while outside the walls, the world continued its rhythm: weddings, births, whispered affairs, and quiet confessions. Chastity was praised, but rarely practiced perfectly. Confessionals were filled with murmured regrets, some genuine, others fearful. Priests reminded their flocks that even within marriage, pleasure for its own sake was sinful. Intercourse was for procreation, anything beyond that was indulgence. Yet people are rarely guided by doctrine alone. The heart has its own theology. In monasteries, the rules were strict, the body denied, the spirit elevated. But temptations still found their way in. Chronicles from the 13th and 14th centuries record scandals, monks and nuns caught in secret meetings, entire abbeys punished for what their leaders called acts of weakness. Some historians now suggest those tales were exaggerated, used to reinforce authority. But whether myth or truth, they reveal something timeless. No matter the walls built to contain it, human nature finds its path. Among the common folk, things were less confined by theology, though no less shaped by fear. A peasant's hut had no privacy. Parents, children, and animals often shared the same space. Courtship was practical, affection shown in work and gesture. A man might show his interest not with poetry, but with a sturdy roof or a well-plowed field. And yet, folklore tells us of love charms, of herbs said to spark affection, of songs whispered under moonlight. Traveling across Europe, one would find a patchwork of beliefs. In some regions, fertility rituals still carried traces of older, pre-Christian customs. Spring festivals celebrated renewal, not only of crops but of bodies and unions. The Church tried to replace them with saints' days and sermons, but old habits have deep roots. The tension between body and soul defined the era. To be too indulgent was to risk damnation. To be too pure was to deny one's humanity. Between those two extremes, medieval people walked carefully, often guided by superstition more than scripture. But beyond the sermons and the rituals, another, darker reality existed, one that reveals the imbalance of power that haunted medieval life. Slavery, though diminished from its ancient form, persisted under new names. Servitude, debt bondage, and captivity blurred the lines between labor and ownership. And among these systems, bodies were sometimes treated as property. Captured during wars or raids, men and women could find themselves sold or exchanged. In the bustling markets of Mediterranean ports, human trade was an unspoken part of commerce. Venetian merchants, Islamic traders, Byzantine envoys, all participated, each empire rationalizing its actions. The victims rarely had a voice. Some were absorbed into households as servants, others as concubines or forced partners. Yet even in these bleak arrangements, history records traces of resistance, women who gained influence within courts or households, who learned to navigate the narrow corridors of power available to them. Their names rarely survived, but their impact did. For example, in 12th century Iberia, chronicles mention a Christian woman enslaved in a Moorish household who became an intermediary between faiths, teaching her children both languages, both prayers. In a world built on hierarchy and domination, such acts were quiet rebellions, asserting identity through memory. Meanwhile, in the courts of Europe, desire and politics intertwined in more subtle ways. Kings and queens had official marriages, but behind every royal lineage stood rumors of lovers, mistresses, and illegitimate heirs. Chroniclers, often clergy themselves, wrote about these affairs with veiled disapproval and secret fascination. Courtly love, the refined, poetic admiration between knight and lady, emerged as a strange contradiction. On one hand, it idealized purity and restraint, on the other, it was born from forbidden longing. Troubadours sang of unattainable women, weaving passion into allegory. It was a game of glances, letters, and coded words, a way to speak of love without ever naming the act itself. By the late Middle Ages, the balance between faith and desire had grown even more complex. The Church's rules were known, but so were the loopholes. Pilgrimages sometimes became excuses for escape or adventure. Confessors could be lenient, for a price. And across Europe, towns quietly tolerated what official doctrine forbade, brothels, discreet and regulated, functioning under civic supervision. In places like London, Paris, and Florence, these establishments were hidden but known. Taxes were collected, rules were enforced. The idea was control, better to contain sin than let it roam. Yet behind those walls, lives unfolded in silence, often tragic, sometimes resilient. Those who worked in such places were rarely free. Some were driven by poverty, others coerced by circumstance or power. Records from the 14th century speak of women petitioning for freedom, for better conditions, for recognition. They were part of a world that society pretended not to see, yet could not exist without. And through all of it, the sermons, the confessions, the whispered transactions, medieval Europe remained haunted by its own contradictions. The body was both sacred and shameful, desired and despised. Love was divine when channeled through marriage, dangerous when sought outside it. But it was always there, pulsing quietly beneath the stone walls and wooden roofs, refusing to be erased. Structures of power and the rules of desire. As Europe slowly moved from the early to the high Middle Ages, the contours of society became more rigid, yet human desire remained as fluid as ever. The rise of feudalism brought with it a network of obligations and hierarchies, each layer prescribing its own moral and social code. Lords and vassals, kings and knights, peasants and serfs. Every person was bound not only by laws and duties, but by the invisible threads of expectation that guided behavior, including the most intimate parts of life. Peasant families, though burdened by labor and subsistence, often experienced affection in ways the elite could not afford. Marriage was a necessity, but tenderness was expressed in shared work, in protection, in simple gestures of care. Women tilled the fields alongside their husbands, watched over children, prepared meals, and mended garments. Men, in turn, shared in the small rhythms of domestic life, helping when possible, comforting when needed. Here, intimacy was practical, silent, and sometimes fleetingly joyous, glimpsed in the quiet laughter by the fire or the whispered encouragement after a hard day's labor. In noble households, the stakes were different. Alliances formed through arranged marriages dictated both property and political stability. Yet even among the most calculated unions, passion could emerge unexpectedly. The courtly love tradition, which began in the 11th century in regions like Aquitaine and Provence, offered a socially sanctioned outlet for romantic admiration, though it was often idealized, detached from physical consummation. Knights sang praises of unattainable ladies, composing intricate poems, participating in tournaments where prowess in combat symbolized devotion. The ritualized secrecy, the coded gestures, created a world where desire could exist safely within the boundaries of etiquette, yet always under the watchful gaze of societal norms. Monastic life, by contrast, demanded a stark rejection of earthly pleasure. Men and women who took vows of chastity entered spaces designed to suppress desire. Cloisters were quiet, austere, ruled by strict schedules of prayer, labor, and study. Silence itself became a method of control. Yet history records that even in these controlled spaces, human impulses persisted. Monks and nuns, tempted by proximity, opportunity, or even mere curiosity, sometimes broke vows. Scandals, recorded with varying degrees of embellishment, hint at the ever-present tension between devotion and the natural inclinations of the flesh. Religion in the medieval period was not merely a personal compass. It dictated laws, customs, and punishments. Church authorities attempted to regulate sexual behavior at every level. Premarital relations, adultery, and any sexual expression outside procreation were condemned. Confessionals were venues for private negotiation of sin. Individuals confessed transgressions, sought absolution, and sometimes received penances that ranged from prayer to public humiliation. The goal was correction, but it also reflected an acknowledgement of the persistent presence of desire that no law could fully suppress. Beyond the domestic and religious spheres, commerce and conflict produced another dimension to intimacy: the forced sexual labor of enslaved or captured individuals. Warfare, raids, and political intrigue regularly produced captives, many of whom were women, men, or children stripped of freedom and autonomy. Trade networks, both overland and maritime, facilitated the movement of these individuals. Records from Mediterranean ports, from Venice to Alexandria, note transactions of human property alongside goods like spices and textiles. While European society increasingly categorized these practices under terms like servitude or bondage, the human cost remained real, and the victims' experiences rarely entered official histories. Within households, those who were enslaved or bound by debt often served multiple roles. Some worked the fields, others performed domestic labor. A smaller number were assigned to intimate roles: concubines, wet nurses, or attendants. Their existence, though essential to the functioning of society, was socially invisible. Yet historical documents reveal glimpses of agency: petitions for better treatment, opportunities to gain freedom, or even subtle influence over the households they served. The evidence is sparse, but it is enough to remind us that even in oppressive structures, survival and quiet assertion of identity persisted. The regulation of sexuality extended beyond individuals to entire communities. In urban centers, authorities sometimes permitted regulated sexual activity within specific confines. Brothels were tolerated and taxed. Their existence reflected the belief that containment of desire was preferable to outright prohibition. Towns such as Paris and London had designated zones for such establishments. Patrons, sellers, and overseers all navigated complex social rules. Who could enter, who could work, what behaviors were acceptable. Public morality was maintained not through eradication of desire but through careful management and observation. Across Europe, the perception of sexual morality shifted over time, influenced by local traditions, economic conditions, and religious reform. In the 12th and 13th centuries, new theological writings codified moral expectations more explicitly. Clerics and scholars debated the nature of sin, the proper role of marriage, and the ethics of desire. Works by theologians like Thomas Aquinas attempted to reconcile human inclination with divine law, creating intellectual frameworks that would influence European society for centuries. Desire was not merely personal, it was a question of ethics, law, and cosmic order. Yet history also remembers the spaces where rules were bent or broken. Festivals, pilgrimages, and fairs offered opportunities for temporary freedom from the rigid hierarchies of daily life. People might flirt, dance, or exchange tokens of affection with relative anonymity. Some historians suggest that these events allowed social experimentation, fleeting expressions of autonomy, connection, and pleasure within otherwise structured societies. The medieval imagination was fertile with stories of lovers meeting in secret, of clever subversions of authority, and of the negotiation between public morality and private longing. Gender shaped every aspect of experience. Men and women were assigned roles, responsibilities, and expectations that defined both public and private life. Patriarchy dictated legal and economic authority, yet within households, women often held influence in subtle, strategic ways. Noble women managed estates, supervised servants, and sometimes influenced political alliances. Peasant women participated in labor that sustained their families and communities, exercising a form of practical power rooted in necessity. Even in systems that appeared entirely hierarchical, relationships were negotiated daily, revealing the interplay of dependence, resistance, and affection. The shifting tides of late medieval desire by the 14th century, Europe had undergone profound transformations. Towns expanded, trade networks grew, and cities became bustling hubs of activity, where markets, churches, guilds, and homes coexisted in a delicate balance. These changes reshaped not only the economy but also social life and the ways intimacy and desire were experienced. Urbanization introduced a measure of anonymity that rural life had rarely allowed. People could interact in spaces less constrained by familial oversight, explore relationships beyond their immediate social class, and participate in communities that operated under new rules. Guilds dominated economic and social organization in towns. Membership dictated occupation, marriage prospects, and social networks. Artisans, merchants, and laborers formed bonds of mutual obligation, trust, and sometimes rivalry. Within this system, marriage was both personal and practical. Young men and women might choose partners with an eye toward financial stability, social connection, or shared trade expertise. Yet, even within this structured environment, affection and desire found ways to manifest. Lovers exchanged letters, tokens, and gifts. The anonymity of crowded streets and bustling marketplaces offered fleeting moments of intimacy, glimpses of a private life in a public world. The Church's influence remained pervasive. Religious authorities regulated marriage, sexuality, and even daily interaction between men and women. Canon law dictated procedures for betrothal, consent, and marital legitimacy. Clerics scrutinized unions for compatibility, dowries, and moral propriety. Adultery, premarital relations, and fornication were condemned, sometimes punished with fines, public penance, or exclusion from sacraments. yet enforcement was inconsistent. Local custom, social standing, and personal negotiation often determined outcomes. In towns, as in the countryside, morality was frequently mediated by practical concerns rather than strict doctrine. Despite these constraints, desire continued to surface in forms both visible and concealed. Literature, songs, and art reflected the complexities of human intimacy. Courtly romance evolved into more elaborate narratives, chronicling the trials, longing, and ingenuity of lovers. Allegories of virtue, fidelity, and passion permeated texts, while visual art explored allegorical depictions of love, temptation, and morality. These cultural artifacts suggest a society deeply engaged with questions of desire, power, and propriety, even as it maintained outward appearances of discipline and restraint. The darker realities of the era persisted alongside these expressions. Enslavement and forced labor, though evolving from earlier practices, remained a grim component of medieval life. Wars, raids, and political upheavals continued to produce captives who could be sold, traded, or absorbed into households as servants or concubines. These individuals navigated precarious existences, often relying on wit, endurance, and the faintest opportunities to assert agency. Court records, letters, and chronicles occasionally illuminate these lives, offering glimpses of strategies for survival, negotiation, and subtle influence within constrained circumstances. Sexuality, power, and commerce intersected in ways that could be both regulated and exploited. Brothels remained present in urban centers, often under civic supervision. Authorities sought to contain activity, enforce public health, and collect taxes, reflecting the belief that controlled indulgence was preferable to disorder. Those working in these spaces faced precarious conditions, yet some managed to exercise agency, negotiate terms, or gain protection through alliances with patrons or influential figures. History records cases of individuals petitioning local authorities for recognition, compensation, or liberation, testament to resilience in oppressive systems. Gender continued to shape experiences profoundly. Patriarchal structures dictated legal authority, economic control, and societal expectation. Men dominated public life, held land, and enforced norms, yet women exerted influence through domestic management, strategic alliances, and social maneuvering. Noblewomen, for instance, could act as regents, manage estates, or sponsor religious and cultural endeavors. Peasant women wielded practical authority within the household and community, guiding labor, child rearing, and resource allocation. Even within seemingly rigid hierarchies, human interaction remained complex, negotiated daily in ways both subtle and enduring. The late Middle Ages also saw the persistence of rituals and traditions that reflected older beliefs. Seasonal festivals, fertility rites, and communal gatherings retained echoes of pre-Christian practices. Even as the Church attempted to overlay these customs with moral instruction, popular participation ensured their survival. Dancing, singing, and feasting offered opportunities for social interaction, courtship, and temporary freedom from hierarchical constraints. Such moments reveal the tension between official morality and lived experience, highlighting a society continuously balancing spiritual ideals with human impulses. Religious reform and intellectual debate reshaped perceptions of morality, sexuality, and social conduct. Scholarly treatises explored the ethics of desire, the obligations of marriage, and the intersection of law and morality. Clergy, theologians, and judges deliberated on the nature of sin, the proper boundaries of intimacy, and the responsibilities of both sexes. These discourses informed legal codes, parish regulations, and cultural expectations, creating frameworks that guided behavior across regions and social classes. Yet interpretation remained flexible, contingent on circumstance, local custom, and the interplay of power. Even in the most restrictive contexts, the human capacity for connection endured. Stories, folklore, and chronicles describe lovers circumventing obstacles, navigating complex social codes, and asserting agency in small, meaningful ways. The medieval imagination, through narrative and ritual, revealed a fascination with desire that was at once feared, controlled, and celebrated. Love and intimacy, though shaped by social structures, found expression in private gestures, symbolic communication, and enduring memory. Thus, the late medieval period presents a landscape defined by contradiction, regulation and freedom, morality and desire, subjugation and resilience. Across towns, castles, monasteries, and fields, human life continued in its quiet complexity. People sought connection, navigated authority, and negotiated intimacy within ever-present boundaries. The stories that remain, chronicles, letters, legal records, and art, offer glimpses of lives lived fully, even under constraint, illuminating the persistence of human nature beneath layers of control, ritual, and societal expectation. Transitioning worlds. Early modern echoes of desire and control. As the 15th century gave way to the dawn of early modern Europe, societies experienced profound shifts. Trade expanded further, connecting distant regions with unprecedented intensity. Cities grew in size and complexity, hosting populations that were increasingly diverse in origin, occupation, and status. These changes reverberated through social, economic, and cultural life, subtly transforming the ways intimacy, sexuality, and human relations were experienced. The spread of commerce introduced new forms of independence for some, particularly within urban centers. Young men and women could work as apprentices, servants, or artisans in households far from their birthplaces. These circumstances created opportunities for relationships beyond family oversight, allowing desire to find new channels of expression. Letters, tokens, and songs became tools for private communication. Even in environments governed by strict norms, affection and romantic intrigue found openings, and anonymity in crowded streets allowed social experimentation. Marriage remained a cornerstone of social stability, but patterns of choice evolved. While economic considerations continued to dominate, the presence of urban communities allowed for negotiation and subtle resistance. Love, though rarely idealized in legal frameworks, could influence decisions. Stories from municipal records and personal correspondences suggest that individuals sometimes prioritized affection or companionship alongside practical concerns, a quiet assertion of human desire against societal constraint. The influence of religion persisted, guiding moral expectations and legal structures. Canon law governed betrothal, consent, and marital legitimacy. Clerical authorities continued to condemn extramarital relations and premarital intimacy, often enforcing penalties through fines, public penance, or exclusion from sacraments. Yet these controls were frequently negotiated, overlooked, or circumvented. Enforcement varied widely by region, social status, and circumstance. In practice, morality was a dynamic interplay of doctrine, custom, and human behavior. In parallel, structures of power that bound the body remained prominent. Slavery, servitude, and debt bondage, though evolving, continued to shape experiences. Wars, raids, and piracy produced captives who were absorbed into households, labor systems, or intimate roles. Historical records indicate that such individuals often sought agency where possible, petitioning for freedom, negotiating labor conditions, or cultivating influence within domestic hierarchies. These narratives illuminate resilience and adaptability, offering a counterpoint to the oppressive structures surrounding them. Urban centers also formalized control over sexual activity. Brothels, regulated by civic authorities, continued to operate as tolerated spaces. Taxes and oversight reflected an understanding that containment of desire maintained social order. Workers in these spaces navigated precarious conditions, yet historical evidence shows that some exercised agency, establishing networks of protection, negotiating terms, or achieving limited social mobility. These arrangements underscore the complexity of moral, economic, and social forces at play in shaping intimate lives. Gender continued to define opportunity and restriction. Patriarchal hierarchies granted men legal and economic authority, yet women exercised influence through domestic management, social maneuvering, and strategic alliances. Noblewomen acted as regents, estate managers, and patrons of culture or religion, shaping political and social landscapes. Peasant and urban women exercised practical power within households and communities, mediating labor, childcare, and resource allocation. Even in systems dominated by male authority, human interaction remained intricate, negotiated daily in both subtle and enduring ways. Cultural and artistic expression reflected these dynamics. Literature, music, and visual art explored desire, morality, and social constraint. Tales of secret lovers, forbidden longing, and clever subversion appeared alongside moralistic narratives, revealing fascination with intimacy even within frameworks of control. Allegorical art depicted temptation and virtue, while popular songs and poetry conveyed private emotion, offering insight into lives that official records often ignored. The late medieval to early modern transition also saw continuity in ritual and social custom. Festivals, pilgrimages, and communal gatherings preserved older traditions while accommodating new norms. Dancing, singing, and ceremonial displays offered avenues for courtship and social interaction. In these contexts, public life and private desire intersected, and individuals navigated opportunities for connection while adhering to, or subtly challenging, societal expectations. Legal and intellectual frameworks adapted to these changing realities. The writings of theologians, jurists, and philosophers elaborated on the ethics of desire, the obligations of marriage, and the intersections of law, morality, and social hierarchy. Debate and codification sought to reconcile human inclination with divine and civic order. Yet interpretation remained variable, contingent on local custom, social standing, and circumstance. In practice, human desire persisted, navigating boundaries, rules, and constraints. Even under scrutiny, human agency endured. Lovers found ways to communicate secretly, women negotiated power within households, and individuals in servitude exerted subtle influence over their circumstances. These acts, often small and invisible to official chroniclers, reveal a continuity of human resilience and ingenuity across centuries. Intimacy persisted not despite societal regulation, but often because of it, shaping narratives of connection, negotiation, and survival that echo into the historical record. Thus, the shift from medieval to early modern Europe illustrates both continuity and transformation. Structures of authority, morality, and social order remained influential, but new urban, economic, and cultural conditions reshaped human experience. Desire, connection, and agency persisted, sometimes constrained, sometimes amplified by evolving circumstances. Across these centuries, the interplay of power, intimacy, and human ingenuity offers a lens through which the lived experience of ordinary and extraordinary individuals can be understood, a testament to the enduring complexity of human life beneath the rigid scaffolding of law, faith, and tradition. Survival, negotiation, and the persistence of desire. By the dawn of the 17th century, Europe had become a patchwork of emerging states, cities, and cultural centers. Political consolidation, growing commerce, and shifting religious authority created new social structures, yet human intimacy and desire remained enduring forces, quietly shaping lives across hierarchies. Even in contexts of strict moral regulation, individuals navigated, negotiated, and subtly asserted autonomy. Enslaved and bound individuals, whether captured in conflict, born into servitude, or constrained by debt, experienced lives defined by both limitation and resilience. Records from urban centers, rural estates, and maritime trade reveal strategies of survival, petitions for liberty, careful cultivation of alliances, and subtle manipulation of household dynamics. Some attained influence within the confines of domestic life, serving as intermediaries, advisors, or caretakers. These acts of agency, often invisible to chroniclers, illustrate how human ingenuity persisted under systemic oppression. Marriage and courtship continued to balance obligation and desire. Among elites, unions secured alliances, wealth, and political stability, but affection could still emerge within carefully managed frameworks. Letters, gifts, and private communication offered means of expressing attachment without violating social codes. In towns and villages, marriages often served practical survival, yet tenderness appeared in small gestures, shared labor, guidance of children, and acts of care that reinforced connection within constrained circumstances. The church retained central influence over sexual morality, but enforcement was uneven. Clerics monitored marriage contracts, penances, and community conduct, condemning premarital relations, adultery, and fornication. Yet local custom, social negotiation, and status often mediated outcomes, revealing the dynamic tension between moral ideals and lived reality. Desire continued to assert itself, quietly shaping behavior even under scrutiny. Urban regulation of sexual activity persisted. Brothels operated under civic supervision, reflecting a pragmatic approach to containing desire. Workers navigated complex social and economic networks, negotiating protection, patronage, and terms of service. These arrangements illuminate intersections of morality, economics, and personal agency, demonstrating that even in constrained spaces, negotiation and influence were possible. Gender hierarchies remained central. Patriarchal authority shaped legal, economic, and political power, yet women exercised influence through domestic management, social strategy, and subtle negotiation. Noblewomen could govern estates, act as regents, or sponsor cultural initiatives. Peasant and urban women managed households, labor, and community resources, negotiating obligations with skill and subtlety. Even within restrictive systems, human interaction remained dynamic, negotiated daily in acts both overt and covert. Cultural expression reflected societal tension. Literature, song, and art explored desire, morality, and constraint. Narratives of secret lovers, clever subversion, and negotiation of authority circulated widely. Allegorical art depicted temptation, virtue, and human longing, while popular songs and poetry expressed personal emotion. These creative forms illustrate the persistent fascination with intimacy, illustrating how desire adapted to, and sometimes resisted, structural limitations. Community rituals offered additional avenues for social interaction. Pilgrimages, seasonal festivals, and fairs provided spaces for negotiation, connection, and discreet expression of affection. Dancing, singing, and ceremonial performance allowed participants to balance social norms with personal desire, creating temporary openings within structured hierarchies. These spaces demonstrate the interplay between constraint and expression, showing how intimacy persisted even under careful regulation. Legal and intellectual discourse continued to shape perception. The writings of theologians, jurists, and philosophers codified moral, marital, and social expectations. Yet interpretation remained flexible, influenced by local custom, circumstance, and negotiation. Desire, affection, and human agency persisted, navigating boundaries imposed by authority, law, and tradition. Individuals adapted, finding ways to assert connection, exert influence, and survive within structured frameworks. In both elite and common life, social and intimate interactions reflected resilience. People cultivated relationships, expressed affection, and negotiated boundaries despite the persistent presence of hierarchy and moral regulation. Lives were shaped by social, religious, and economic structures, yet agency endured. Desire persisted, often subtly, through gestures, communication, and personal strategy. Even those constrained by servitude or debt found avenues to assert identity, influence circumstances, and maintain connection. The historical record, though fragmentary, preserves these traces. Letters, petitions, court documents, and chronicles reveal the quiet persistence of human desire. Even under conditions designed to suppress individuality or restrict freedom, people navigated relationships, asserted autonomy, and maintained intimacy. Across centuries, these experiences demonstrate the enduring tension between regulation and expression, hierarchy and agency, constraint and desire. By the early modern period, the patterns of human intimacy and negotiation had become deeply embedded. Social structures, religious authority, and economic necessity shaped behavior, yet desire persisted, adapting to circumstances and asserting itself through subtle means. The interplay of power, morality, and human connection remains central to lived experience, offering a nuanced view of historical life that goes beyond law, doctrine, or hierarchy to reveal the enduring complexity of the human heart. Hierarchy, morality, and the subtle persistence of agency. As the early modern period deepened, European societies became increasingly structured. Monarchies centralized power, urban centers expanded, and trade and commerce reshaped both opportunity and constraint. Within this evolving framework, human intimacy, morality, and desire remained persistent forces, continually negotiating their place amidst hierarchy, law, and faith. The social architecture of the period dictated the boundaries of personal conduct. Marriage, whether arranged for political or economic reasons, remained the primary socially sanctioned form of intimacy. Noble families used marital alliances to consolidate wealth, secure loyalty, and ensure succession. Among commoners, unions were grounded in survival and mutual assistance. Yet across all social strata, affection and desire found subtle avenues for expression. Private letters, clandestine meetings, and small gestures of care allowed individuals to navigate the tension between societal expectation and personal inclination. Religious authority maintained oversight, guiding moral behavior through canon law, confessional practice, and community enforcement. Clerics monitored betrothal, marital conduct, and sexual propriety. Violations, premarital relations, adultery, fornication, could attract penalties ranging from public penance to fines or social ostracism. Enforcement, however, was uneven. Local custom, social standing, and circumstance frequently mediated outcomes. Desire persisted, quietly shaping behavior in ways that chroniclers sometimes recorded and sometimes left unspoken. Systems of servitude and dependency endured alongside evolving hierarchies. Enslaved or bound individuals were present in households, cities, and rural estates, performing labor that was both essential and regulated. Historical documents reveal subtle forms of negotiation and agency within these constraints. Some petitioned for freedom, others cultivated influence through social networks, and many relied on careful adherence to protocol to improve conditions. These acts of quiet assertion highlight the resilience and ingenuity of individuals within oppressive systems. Urban regulation of sexual activity reflected the pragmatic priorities of civic authorities. Brothels, often licensed and taxed, functioned as spaces in which desire could be contained and controlled. Workers in these establishments navigated a complex interplay of social norms, protection from patrons, and municipal oversight. Though vulnerable, some managed to exercise agency, negotiate conditions, or establish influence, demonstrating how human behavior adapted within regulated environments. Gender dynamics continued to shape opportunity and limitation. Patriarchal authority governed legal, economic, and political structures, yet women exerted influence in subtle and enduring ways. Noblewomen acted as estate managers, regents, and patrons of cultural or religious projects. Peasant and urban women managed households, labor, and community resources, negotiating obligations and asserting practical power within prescribed boundaries. Even under rigid hierarchies, social interactions remained dynamic, negotiated daily through acts both overt and covert. Cultural and literary expression remained central to understanding human desire and morality. Literature, poetry, and song explored themes of longing, restriction, and subtle subversion. Allegorical art depicted virtue, temptation, and human longing, while folklore and popular narratives conveyed experiences that official records often overlooked. These creative forms provide insight into the persistent fascination with intimacy, revealing how desire adapted to social constraints while maintaining its presence. Community rituals and public gatherings offered additional space for negotiation of personal and social boundaries. Pilgrimages, fairs, and festivals provided opportunities for interaction, courtship, and fleeting reprieves from hierarchical restriction. Through dance, music, and ceremony, participants navigated a complex balance between societal norms and individual inclination. Such occasions illustrate the nuanced interplay of regulation and personal expression, highlighting the persistence of desire within socially sanctioned spaces. Legal and intellectual discourse codified expectations while leaving room for negotiation. Theological, juridical, and philosophical writings explored the nature of desire, moral obligation, and social conduct. Interpretation was often flexible, influenced by custom, circumstance, and individual discretion. Within these frameworks, human desire continued to assert itself, operating through subtle communication, private negotiation, and strategic compliance. Across social classes, mechanisms of survival, negotiation, and agency persisted. Lovers found discreet ways to express affection. Women exercised influence within households, communities, and cultural spheres. Individuals bound by servitude or social constraint leveraged small opportunities to assert autonomy. These actions, though often invisible to official chronicles, demonstrate the continuity of human resilience in the face of systemic limitation. By the late early modern period, the interplay of hierarchy, morality, and desire had become deeply ingrained in the fabric of European life. Laws and norms constrained behavior, yet human agency persisted, finding expression in private, symbolic, and strategic acts. Desire remained a persistent, adaptive force, shaping the rhythms of social interaction, domestic life, and community practice. The historical record, though selective, preserves these traces of resilience, revealing a continuum of experience in which intimacy and agency endured beneath the structures of authority. Through centuries of regulation, hierarchy, and moral prescription, human desire proved neither absent nor easily contained. From the quiet gestures of peasants to the strategic influence of the enslaved, from courtly letters to festive interaction, intimacy persisted. It adapted, survived, and flourished in ways that were subtle, often hidden, but always present. The narrative of medieval and early modern Europe, when viewed through the lens of lived experience, reveals a world in which the tension between constraint and expression was not merely a backdrop, but a defining feature of human life. Continuity and adaptation. The human heart beneath authority. By the 17th century, Europe's social, political, and economic landscapes had evolved significantly, yet the fundamental tensions of hierarchy, morality, and desire remained strikingly consistent. Across urban centers, rural villages, and noble courts, the human capacity for connection persisted, negotiating boundaries imposed by law, custom, and faith. Marriage continued to serve as the central institution of social stability. Among elites, unions were instruments of political and economic strategy, carefully orchestrated to preserve property and alliances. Among commoners, marriage functioned as a mechanism of survival, structuring household labor, inheritance, and social support. Yet within these frameworks, affection and desire found expression. Letters, subtle gestures, and private communication provided avenues for emotional connection, demonstrating that even highly regulated environments could not erase the human impulse for intimacy. The Church maintained influence over sexual morality, prescribing conduct, mediating disputes, and sanctioning violations. Clerics monitored betrothal, marital relations, and private behavior, often insisting on penance for transgressions. Enforcement, however, was inconsistent. Local custom, social standing, and practical negotiation mediated outcomes, highlighting the ongoing tension between prescribed morality and lived experience. Human desire continued to assert itself, quietly shaping behavior within and around formal structures. Systems of servitude, whether through slavery, debt, or household dependence, persisted as instruments of economic and social control. Individuals subjected to these systems navigated their conditions with remarkable subtlety. Historical evidence illustrates strategies of negotiation, cultivating favor, petitioning for freedom, and leveraging influence within households or communities. These acts of resilience demonstrate the persistent capacity for agency even in the most constrained circumstances. Urban governance reflected pragmatic approaches to sexuality. Licensed brothels, municipal oversight, and regulated spaces acknowledged the inevitability of desire while seeking to contain it. Those working in these environments exercised strategic negotiation, relying on networks of patronage and social knowledge. Such practices illustrate the complex interplay between morality, economics, and human autonomy, revealing both the constraints and possibilities embedded in structured societies. Gender continued to shape opportunity and limitation. Patriarchal authority dominated legal, economic, and political structures, yet women exercised significant influence. Noblewomen managed estates, acted as regents, and sponsored cultural and religious endeavors. Peasant and urban women directed household labor, mediated community interactions, and strategically navigated social hierarchies. Even in environments designed to limit autonomy, women found ways to assert influence, demonstrating resilience across centuries. Cultural expression reflected the persistent fascination with intimacy. Literature, song, folklore, and visual art explored themes of desire, morality, and negotiation. Narratives of secret lovers, subtle subversion, and creative resistance circulated widely, offering insight into experiences often absent from official records. Allegorical and symbolic depictions of human longing illustrated both the constraints and the creative adaptations imposed by social, legal, and moral structures. Public rituals, festivals, and communal events offered space for negotiation and interaction. Pilgrimages, fairs, and seasonal celebrations provided opportunities for social and emotional engagement, allowing participants to navigate the delicate balance between societal norms and personal desire. Through dance, song, and ceremonial performance, individuals exercised agency within socially sanctioned spaces, demonstrating the enduring capacity for human connection even under close regulation. Legal and intellectual discourse codified expectations while leaving room for interpretation. The writings of theologians, jurists, and philosophers explored the nature of desire, the obligations of marriage, and social conduct. Interpretation was flexible, shaped by custom, circumstance, and individual negotiation. Within these frameworks, human desire persisted, navigating boundaries, asserting connection, and influencing outcomes in both subtle and tangible ways. Across social strata, mechanisms of negotiation, survival, and agency persisted. Lovers communicated discreetly, women influenced domestic and political spheres, and those constrained by servitude or social hierarchy employed strategic methods to assert autonomy. These acts, often invisible to chroniclers, reveal a continuous thread of resilience, demonstrating that human connection endured across centuries and across structures of power. In synthesizing these threads, a clear pattern emerges. Desire, intimacy, and agency remain central to human experience, even as social, religious, and economic structures sought to regulate them. Hierarchies imposed constraints, morality prescribed limits, and authority monitored behavior, yet the human heart consistently found ways to express, navigate, and survive within these boundaries. The historical record, though incomplete, offers glimpses of these persistent dynamics. Letters, chronicles, petitions, court records, and artistic works reveal lives lived fully within constraint, illustrating the tension between societal regulation and personal autonomy. Desire endured, quiet, adaptable, and persistent, asserting itself in gestures, strategies, and communication that transcended social rank and circumstance. Thus, the narrative of medieval and early modern Europe reveals a world defined by the interplay of constraint and expression, authority and agency, morality and desire. Across centuries, human beings adapted to circumstances while maintaining the core impulse for connection, intimacy, and self-expression. From peasant cottages to noble courts, from monastic silence to bustling streets, the persistence of desire serves as a testament to the enduring complexity of human life and the subtle, enduring ways in which agency can assert itself even under the most pervasive constraints.